From the time I could walk, I'd been expressing myself through music. My dad is a musician, and I had all sorts of instruments around me growing up. I think I wrote my first song around 5. As a kid, I was regularly exposed to the opera, ballet, and symphony, as well as many other kinds of music. But even before I could play an instrument, I learned to use crayons and paints to express myself. As I got older, I became interested in film and found another way to be creative. Today I have very few limits in expressing myself through music, songwriting, art, and film. Some may even call me an artist. At least I consider myself a lover of art. As a college student taking a class on the philosophy of art and aesthetics, one of the first things you learn is Plato's theory of art. I learned a little bit about Plato as a kid. Mainly I remember being interested in his famous book, The Republic. In that book, Plato didn't think artists were good for the Republic, which is something I could never understand, especially considering the fact that Plato didn't write much about his own philosophy in the Republic, but wrote stories that featured his teacher, Socrates. Plato's philosophy is expressed as stories, rather than essays, which makes Plato sound like an artist to me. Now I find myself having a few questions. Like, who was Plato? And what may have influenced his theory of art? Why would he make such strong claims about art? How did he form his argument? Where can I see some examples of his theory? What's a good counter-argument to his theory? And finally, is his argument too narrow, or do I agree with Plato? While I'm certainly no expert, it can be argued as common knowledge that Plato lived in the 4th century BCE. He was a Greek philosopher born in Athens during the classical period in ancient Greece. He was the student of Socrates, who also appeared as a central character in all of Plato's discourses except for one. It may be less common knowledge that during Plato's time, students were heavily influenced by the poetry of Homer. Many in the culture believed Homer's writing was based in fact, by using the justification that if Homer was so good at poetry, he must be an expert on what he was writing about, which was a grave concern for Socrates. Socrates thought poetry was not a credible source of knowledge, lacking logic and reason, with potential harm in misrepresenting reality. Maybe in an abstract way, attempting to understand the context in which Plato formed his views is applying similar critical thinking he used to make his theory. The way I learned Plato's theory about art was through his idea of the forms. I understood it this way. Everything that exists on the earth originally stems from the purest idea of the thing, which Plato called the forms. For example, as I look at this tree, I'm seeing a copy of the form of treeness. Every atom of the tree I'm looking at contains treeness, but this particular tree does not represent all trees. Plato would call this tree a copy of the form and most reliable source of information about treeness we can know, because the properties of treeness exist only as an unknowable form. Plato uses a bed to make his point. Here's a quote from the Republic Book 10, which Plato writes, "Now, the god, either because he didn't want to, or is necessary for him not to do so, didn't make more than one bed in nature, but only one, the very one that is being of a bed." You see, for Plato, every bed contains the properties of being a bed, yet no one particular bed represents all beds. A craftsman can make a bed, and we can observe the craftsman's bed at any angle and any point of view. Although it's not the original form of bedness, it is a copy once removed and represents the most we can know about bedness, which is the form. Plato gives the craftsmen a pass in his Republic because they are creating things as close to reality as possible. The artists, not so much. Plato paints artists something like this. If the craftsman can give us a 3D, close as you can get to bedness on Earth, can actually sleep in it bed, the painter that paints the bed is actually making a copy of the form. That's the first concern. We are getting knowledge twice removed from the source, which for Plato is not a good source of knowledge. To top it off, the painter only gives one particular view of a bed, which may be manipulated to deceive the viewer. Maybe making this bed more enticing, or leading us to believe that this bed represents bedness, the form which all beds are created. When actually, the painter's bed has only the appearance of bedness without having the fundamental qualities of bedness, like being able to sleep on it, for example. For Plato, not only is some art a bad example for which to draw knowledge, he thinks that if a painter truly had skill, he wouldn't waste his time painting the bed, he would make one. Plato definitely had a strong view about artists, so here's a quote. If he truly had knowledge of the things he imitates, he'd be much more serious about actions than about imitations of them. Maybe Plato's view about artists is just a little bit limiting. Consider the painting that expresses no descriptive form. Surely the original form of this painting isn't something a craftsman could make, and whose value isn't measured in utility, but in emotional responses. I think that Plato may agree that some artists are more like craftsmen than propagandists, but if that were true, wouldn't his original claim seem weaker? For example, consider Van Gogh's painting of his bedroom. Here's a picture of his actual restored bedroom, an obvious source of the painting. If we look at it side by side, we can see the actual bed is closer to Plato's form than the painting. You could sleep in the actual bed. But what if the point of the painting wasn't to deceive us about bedness, but to get an emotional response about the joy and comfort of your own bed? If that's possible, then the original form of the painting would be the idea of joy and comfort expressed in a particular view of a bed, not bedness. There are many examples of Plato's argument realized in our modern times. Consider the story of Bill Cosby. Through art, acting on television, he manifested a beloved and trustworthy image as America's dad in the 1980s. His TV show was a hit, and many people associated him with the character he portrayed on his show. He was then accused by dozens of women of sexual misconduct, eventually being convicted of sexual assault, again shown in one particular light. This time, the media painted him as a villain. The point is, art in Plato's context deceived a lot of people to believe Bill Cosby was some sort of god, which he was not, and when he was accused, turned 180 degrees so that the same application of art now convinced many people he was the devil. Regardless of how we may feel about him, the truth is, very few people actually know Bill Cosby's character, and they certainly aren't the people that think they know from what they've read or seen on TV. This is hardly an exception in our culture. People are constantly reacting emotionally about knowledge they've learned through Plato's art filter, art that deceives us about truth. Just about every political election is filled with the very application of art Plato was concerned with. In fact, if Plato could have foreseen the advent of film and television, he probably would have made an even stronger argument. So here again I quote Book 10. Then, imitation is far removed from the truth, for it only touches a small part of each thing, and a part that is itself only an image. I'm guessing Plato didn't think too highly of actors. Film, at its very core, is designed to deceive us. In fact, films that are the most successful in doing so have the most value in our society. Actors that are successful are the best at deceiving us into believing they are someone who they are not. Directors storyboard scenes to control what and how we see everything in the film. Writers plan and organize stories to align to a story arc with resolution planned and scrutinized. It is undoubtedly true that there are people who think films, streaming, and television programs reveal the truth about their subject matter, but there are many more that understand that the truth expressed is emotional, not logical. The form of the film isn't a copy of some utility function, but its own form. There are times when art as propaganda can be helpful in bringing an emotional quality that unifies people. The image of Uncle Sam was used heavily throughout World War II, and certainly served as a unifying symbol for America. More recently, the image of the frontline caregiver in the coronavirus pandemic, used to elicit empathy and concern about protecting some of our society's most vulnerable and each other. Music uses art to convey larger ideas difficult to express in images. When I look at this poster of Marvin Gaye, I can't help but be inspired. The picture doesn't represent the historical Marvin Gaye, but it can represent the emotion you feel listening to his music. The way a musician displays their look on an album cover or magazine is an attempt to make a statement about their art, not their entire person. I think Plato's concern was correct about some art being used to deceive us. The art he was concerned about is ubiquitous in our culture. I suppose the only protection from this art is utilizing similar logic and reason Plato did when writing his book. I think he missed the point of artists, though. Artists don't make the things they paint because they're lazy or untalented. They make art because they choose to attempt to bring other, and just as important, value to society. Without the inspiration and self-reflection that art brings to society, I think that the world would be a very different place. And I don't think that place has any space for me.